want to welcome you to the Monday night study. We're looking at the whole theme of living with wisdom in a world that has lost it. And we're seeking to gain some perspective and understanding of what that wisdom really looks like. And so when we're looking at some of these studies, we've been looking at the Monday night study, and we've been, Monday night study. And what we've just done, though, we've now on the archive on the Monday night study, you can go back and see. So we've done the Psalms here before, and now we're moving from the Psalms. And before that was Job. And then you have to go back for a little bit earlier at the bottom of the page, and then it picks up where we left off with the wisdom of Job there. And it'll go, so you can work your way back all the way to the beginning of this series if you should choose to do that, which is, I think, a very helpful thing to know, at least, that you can go back that far and find it at the bottom of the page. And so that's where you go, like that, Proverbs and so forth. So just to let you know about that. But insofar as we're looking at that, again, this is our outline. Just for any of you who might be new to the study, it's very simple. It turned out to be a 7-part series. Each one has 2 to several, maybe even 15 or so parts, but most of them are short little mini-series on what is wisdom itself. And so how is it defined? How do we attain it? And then we did an extensive overview of Proverbs and these life-transforming, timeless principles that always will, in fact, be relevant. We did this overview of Job, and the thing for me was that really spoke to me most was this idea of learning the secret of obeying the one we cannot understand, and to come to the admission that even to ask the questions and to demand an understanding is a folly, because when you study anything from the natural world, you discover you can't understand any of God's ways, even from nature. Then how do you suppose you're going to understand the mind of the Maker? And that indeed is what we see in the questions that God asked Job, not addressing Job's questions, but rather his creation, and going from the inanimate world to the animate, and all the mysteries and marvels and wonders that fill it. So that really empowered me and excited me to really get into an understanding of nature in a richer way. That combined as well with the last year and so that the kind of more of a strange forced lockdown is in the store, not literally, but the whole world changing March last. And in my case, I came to discover what I've always been enjoying, but now with a greater apprehension, a greater appreciation of the glory of God. And so when I look, for example, at the photos that we have in the garden and so forth, and study these marvels and wonders, I'm amazed at just some photos I just took yesterday of these hollyhocks and arguing. Just look at the structure of this wonderful Chinese maple and the dendritic architecture that is just astonishing. As I've come to explore in the last year and a half, more and more intentionally as I drive, but also even in my own backyard, literally, and come to appreciate things that I always was grateful for, but now I've come to see that we were really given this wonderful treasure that I want to share with other people, because I'm using it almost like as a laboratory. Just look at the succulent ground cover and so forth. And it's like a laboratory for me. So where I share this wonderful rose, and there's the thorn on the top and so forth, and the structure. This is this wonderful poppy anemone. It's just amazing just to watch and behold that. So I see these wonders and these marvels. They're there, and they reveal things about God in richer ways than I had ever suspected. This oak leaf hydrangea, in ways that now I've been seeking to develop an attunement or an apprehension or a comprehension of things that I hadn't seen before. And so this is what I mean by that. It's just been forcing me in many ways to go back to and be seduced into the real world, not the artificial world of digital, but rather the real world of the analog, because that is the world of God's creation. And so we are analogical created beings for this reason. So we resonate and we respond with that created beauty in so many ways. And so this is what I mean by that. So as I study and look at the splendor of a thing like this, and the profligate beauty, the abundance, the overwhelming array, and so forth, I marvel at and wonder at that reality and that richness that we've been given. And then I've been amplifying that as well, as we just going back to that just for a second, because I've been really thinking about these things with the created order in other respects. Just for example, had this book PDF made of this 100 butterflies, and just you look at these wonders and so forth, and each has a story to tell. And you compare it with the caterpillars, and you just look at the structure. And I can't see any evident real comparison between the caterpillars and these elegant, incredible butterflies that just defy belief. And so I've been really building, and I'm seeking to build a larger library. So I look at these caterpillars, it's the same way here. When I look at these wonders and say, what on earth are these for? No one knows. No one knows why you need this kind of a variety. It's no narrative, nor is there any kind of gradual, stepwise foundational basis where one thing can lead in successively to another, because they're so richly diverse from one another. All these 100 different caterpillars, and you just do a quick look at them, and it just staggers the imagination that all this variety, and then you can't even compare it. Here's one that looks like the twig itself that's on. That this is the mind of the maker, and you just marvel at this. But then another book that I've had actually scanned for this reason, because again, looking at pheromones, it's like an amazing thought. This Christopher Marley has actually expanded and gardened this particular area of beetles, of all things. And so here he's curating beetles and moths and butterflies and so forth. And so he's gardening this. But the most interesting thing about this point is if I see an image of this nature, immediately my mind tells me that was something of human derivation, that there was an intelligent design in essentially the pattern that I observed going around here, so that you have this square pattern. And so that's obviously, and then the alternate colors and so forth, we can easily see that. But really, it's much more than that. It's something that is amazing, because though we observe that, yet any of these beetles is boundlessly more elegant, boundlessly greater on every level, and we attribute that to mutations and natural selection. So it's intriguing to me, and that's a sort of a thing is what I've been really chewing on a lot of late, and seeing that this is a point of. So I want to drive and draw people to back to the reality of the world of God's creation and the four words of God, God's infinite word, which is in His general revelation, and then seeing how His inspired and incarnate and indwelling word, that special revelation, amplifies and each helps me understand the other a great deal more. So that's just a diverging pathway, but I just wanted to share that with you. So here now we're up to and about to enter the book of Ecclesiastes. So we've looked at Job, we can't understand him, wisdom, Psalms, the wisdom of actually treating things according to their true value, and the wisdom also of taking the long-term rather than the short-term perspective, because the short-term perspective is just a temporal aspect of things and fails to grasp the larger context. And so the eternal perspective invites us to pursue and perceive the eternal. And we as amphibious beings, as spiritual beings who are embodied in this world and yet are spiritual beings, and in Christ who are now seated with Him in heavenly places, the incredible thought then is that we can actually train ourselves through habituation so that we become more and more in our practice in the soul-forming world who we already are in our position, so that we begin to become increasingly aware as we renew our minds with the things of the Spirit and so forth. As we trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit, we become more habituated, and it becomes more gradually and more naturally becomes our more fundamental milieu, so that the spiritual then and the material are united together, not just theoretically, but also in action, so that even the small tasks of life can be done to the glory of God. So this is a way of looking and of seeing. So having given that as a bit of a brief overview and kind of extra supplement, shall I say, I want to go into the next component. How do we transform futility? And there's so much evident futility would appear under the sun, the perspective that the author takes of what's under the sun, not what's revealed beyond the sun. And so it would appear that there's so much vanity and futility, and that's why he will use this phrase again and again. He will say, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So we'll see what that looks like. And so as with the other books of the Bible, I have a presentation that Bill Ibsen and I created some years ago now. And it goes through every book of the Bible. And this is available at the kenmore.org website. So it's just a talk through the Bible, Old and New Testaments. But at any rate, in the book of Ecclesiastes, it just invites us to see and use this from a point of view that could be very helpful, I hope. So there are always the historical books and the poetical books and the prophetical books that constitute the Hebrew Bible. And out of those, there are 11 of the historical books out of the 17 really carry on that storyline. Then there are some supplemental books that are also included among the 17 historical books, such as Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Ruth, that actually don't necessarily carry on the storyline as much as they supplement the material. And then when we go to the poetical books, apart from Job, they appear to be quite late, and so we're at the time of the kings, and so Samuel and Saul, and you have that period of time then where this wisdom literature appears, and then the historical books. We see that this literature appeared then before the Babylonian exile. And so as we look at this, in our book then, we just get a little bit of some thoughts about this. The key word of this book, as I said earlier, is this word vanity. And it alludes again to the futile emptiness of trying to be happy, to find some kind of satisfaction, meaning, and purpose without God. And it speaks of this as he calls himself the preacher. And so if I go to the idea of Solomon, the book of the song rather than Ecclesiastes rather. And by the way, as you probably know, there's a kind of a assumption that has been made that as a kind of a tradition as well, that the preacher, koheleth is the Hebrew word. It means that one, as we'll see, one who communicates or addresses an assembly. So who is this koheleth? And the tradition, and it seems evident that it's Solomon, and the tradition that Solomon wrote this book perhaps in his later years, the book of Proverbs in his middle years, and Song of Songs in his early years. That's just a tradition, and there may be some truth to that. But let's just pick up on this theme, this phrase that we see, this understanding all is vanity. And he immediately says, Haval Havalim, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And so he raises a number of questions and talks about the apparent cyclical and repetitive nature of things. It's just one thing again and again, as it were. And so it would appear. The sun also rises, and the King James puts it that way, which is where Hemingway got the title of his novel. And the sun sets, and so we see these fundamental themes, that motifs, movements of nature that are cyclical. And he wonders then, is there anything? And he's of course alluding to the life cycle of birth to growth, decay, and death. What will last? What will endure that we can do under the sun? So this phrase becomes very characteristic of this book, this motif of what is in fact under the sun. So life under the sun, from a human vantage point, apart from actual revelatory advantage, so just from that standpoint, it seems then to be an emptiness, just not enough. Power and prestige and pleasure just don't seem to be sufficient to satisfy our longings in this world. And so when we consider the nature of this. We're looking at really as a provision that God only can give, so that you need to have a divine perspective as well, so that life under the sun from the human perspective declares it to be empty. And that's why I say power and popularity, nothing can fill that God void, shaped void. But since we see from God's perspective, then it can take on meaning. It can take on a greater realm of purpose, because we're going beyond the sun, above the sun, in a very real way, to pick up on that metaphor. And so there, then, we can see that we can, as he describes it in this way, and I jumped too far ahead here. I'll go back to my slide and go back to that. And so we see this whole idea of eat and drink and rejoice, do good, live joyfully, fear God, keep his commandments. And when we take those motifs and those exhortations, then the skepticism and despair can diminish when life is now seen as a daily gift from God. In fact, it becomes something entirely different. It depends on your vantage point. As I mentioned, Koheleth, found only in Ecclesiastes, from the word kahal, which means to convoke an assembly, to assemble, one who addresses an assembly, a preacher. And so the Septuagint also used this, a word similar, used the word Ecclesiastes as its title. And that was derived from the Greek word ekklesia, which means assembly, congregation, or church. And it can be then used in that context of one who addresses such an assembly. And so that's where that term comes from. And then the Latin term is a speaker before a book for an assembly as well. So it's very the same idea. So taking a look at the authorship of this book is important for us. So the Solomon, there's evidence for that from an external standpoint. Jewish Talmudic tradition attributes this book to Solomon. But it does suggest that Hezekiah's scribes may have edited the text. Proverbs 25:1 alludes to this, to those the scribes. And Solomonic authorship of Ecclesiastes is indeed not only the Jewish Talmudic, but also the Christian, traditional Christian, though some scholars, along with the Talmud, do believe the work was later edited during the time of Hezekiah or possibly Ezra, and that could be very consistent with that, perhaps later editing. There's some internal evidence as well, that not just the external. The author himself calls himself the son of David, a king in Jerusalem, so that narrows it down very much. And indeed, Solomon was the best qualified Davidic descendant for the quest in this book, because he was the wisest man who ever taught in Jerusalem, according to 1 Kings. And the descriptions of Koheleth's explorations of pleasure in chapter 2 and impressive accomplishments, as well as unparalleled wealth, were fulfilled really only by King Solomon, as we'll see when we look at chapter 2 in more detail. And so the Proverbs in this book are also, we should add, similar to those in the book of Proverbs, particularly chapters 7 and 10. So according to chapter 12 and verse 9, it tells us that Koheleth collected and arranged many proverbs. This may perhaps refer to the 2 Solomonic collections in the book of Proverbs that are attributed clearly to him. And then the unity of authorship as well is supported by the 7 references to Koheleth. So then we turn our attention to the date and setting. So I would just make an additional comment then, that we're looking at someone who is so well qualified because of his wealth and his influence and his power and his prestige, that in fact it led him astray. And this is one of the fundamental things one wrestles with when you're reading about that, really what turns out to be a tragic life of this greatest of minds, only exceeded, of course, by the mind of Christ, the Logos. So how is it possible that such a wise man could become like a fool? And it makes me think about this text of scripture that I've been reflecting upon again in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And it's intriguing because when you look at this chapter, when you consider the book of Deuteronomy and it's anticipating really a king that will come, because the book of Judges, about 400 years, will follow that time of Moses and Joshua. And then there would be the kings. So this anticipates well in advance then the time when they would eventually, in several hundred years, choose a king. So he's anticipating that quite clearly. And so he says, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. And it reminds me of, again, the whole theme, because it was clear the Lord your God was your king, as Samuel said. You have not rejected me, you've rejected your God. So you wanted a monarchy instead of a theocracy. And so it was. And you will surely set, and he then gives a definition. So he's anticipating, prophesying, because Moses was a prophet, a priest, and a king in many ways, but he was prophesying very clearly what's going to take place when they get to the land. And these are the qualifications that you're supposed to have for that person. So it tells us then that he has to be one of your own countrymen. He must not multiply horses, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Since the Lord has sent you, you'll never again return that way. Why would he say not multiply horses? Horses were a symbol of power, effectively. And so is multiplying power effectively, then saying money, sex, and power, as you'll see in these three prohibitions, are being alluded to. So he starts with power. Then he talks about multiplying wives for himself. And the whole mindset of Solomon, he had the philosophy, it seems to me, that if a little was good, more was better, and too much was just right. I mean, no one can imagine how he could have these 700 concubines and 300 wives. It's an astonishing thought. So he went to excess in that realm as well, in defiance of this mandate. And third, he was not to, the king, whoever it would be, was not to greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Once again, Solomon was the wealthiest of men. If you look at his wealth, it's exceedingly vast, especially when you relativize it to the conditions of that time, wealthiest man who had ever existed at that time. And so we have this power and this wealth and money, sex, and power will always pull down, won't they? At the end, though, what's intriguing is there are two additional things that they were supposed to do that were not being done. Most of the kings then, in their differing degrees, sought to get their hearts were pulled astray. And that's what happened with Solomon, because his wives pulled him astray. His heart was moved away from God, and he wanted to worship their gods as well as the God of Israel. And so that led to his absolute demise into folly. This wisest of men became a fool. The overwhelming absurdities that are involved. But what I do see is another wisdom that is not, in fact, engaged in, namely, two things that every king was supposed to do. And to my knowledge, I don't see anyone who did it. When he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you, in addition to the three things he's to avoid, there are two things that he's to pursue. And those two things that he was to pursue then was that he was to be a man of the word and literally write in his own handwriting on a scroll. He was to write the word himself. That would be his own copy. Moreover, he was not only to be a man of the word, but a man of accountability, because you see, he was to do it in the presence of the Levitical priests. And then it tells us the reason for having this, because it says then, when he's got this book, this copy of Torah in his own handwriting, it'll be with him, and he will read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes. Then he adds that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen. In other words, that he walks in humility and the fear of God, that he might not turn aside from the commandment, because he's renewing his mind. So his mind is so set on the word that he will not turn to the right or to the left, and that he and his sons then would continue along in the kingdom. This was what it was meant to be, but to my knowledge, was never actually properly exercised. So it's a great tragedy. I'm not aware of any king who actually seems to have done this thing. And so there are some like Josiah who wept and were at the revealing of the law and so forth. But the interesting thing is you don't see anyone actually having their own copy and their own, that accountability. So I find it to be rather fascinating when we observe that. Picking up though where we've left off though on the date and setting. So it just contextualizes this whole theme of the Book of Solomon, how we can be so seduced away from wisdom in our own life journeys. So as we turn to the date and setting, there's a theory, as some scholars argue, that the literary forms in Ecclesiastes are post-exilic, but they are in fact unique and can't be used in dating this book. You see, they're not pre or post-exilic as such. It's just they're different, but you can't demand that they are post-exilic. And the phrase that all who were before me in Jerusalem has also been used to suggest a date after Solomon's time. But there were many kings and wise men in Jerusalem before the time of Solomon, and that could be accounted for there. And then, so I would also though add, Solomon was the only son of David who reigned over Israel from Jerusalem. So it narrows it down pretty clearly, as I see it. Now, Ecclesiastes was probably written, I think, late in his life, about 935 BC. And if this is so, the great glory that Solomon ushered in early in his reign was already beginning to fade. And the disruption of Israel into two kingdoms as a consequence of this would soon take place. That's why I mentioned before about the Jewish tradition that he may have written a Song of Solomon in his youth, Proverbs in his middle years, and Ecclesiastes late in life. And this book may well be expressing perhaps his regret for his folly, perhaps regret for his wasted time due to carnality and idolatry. That's a possibility. There are no references to historical events other than to personal aspects of Koheleth's life, his works and accomplishments. The location is Jerusalem, and that was the seat of Israel's rule and authority. So it just gives you a perspective of where we are. So when we talk through this book, then, it's helpful to just give a survey of the book, and this is what I plan to do in our remaining time tonight, begin that at least. Ecclesiastes, then, is a very profound and problematic book. It's the record of an intense search for meaning and satisfaction in life on this earth, especially in light of the iniquities and the apparent absurdities that do seem to surround us. And there are plenty of them, as we'll see. A little reflection shows how unjust and absurd many things are. It takes the perspective of the greatest answers of wisdom that they can grant under the sun. So there are limits, but if we're limited not to special revelation, but merely to general revelation under the sun, this would be about the best you could come up with. So then the question is if Ecclesiastes was the preacher, then if the preacher is Solomon, it's the greatest mental, material, and political resources that were ever combined in one human being. He was qualified beyond all others, I think, to write this book. So it gives us a point of view that's rich, and no one else had those resources as did he. It's an extremely difficult book, by the way, to synthesize. Very tough. I'm going to give you another approach after this, maybe a little bit later, but after we complete this overview, because there are other approaches to take. And so there have been alternate narrative approaches. And the one we're going to use here, though, for this purpose, is the approach that the thesis, all is vanity, the proof that all is vain, and the counsel is to fear God, is the counsel for living with vanity. And so if I think about the thesis that all is vanity in 1 to 11 in particular, then we have this introduction of vanity. And after a one-verse introduction, the preacher states his theme, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Life under the sun appears to be futile, perplexing. And then verses 3 to 11, they illustrate this theme in the endless and apparently meaningless cycles that we find in both nature and in history. And then we go into the next section, beginning with chapter 1, verse 12, and go to 6:12. The preacher describes his multiple quests for meaning and satisfaction as he explores his vast personal resources. So he begins with wisdom, but he finds that he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And due to his intense perception of reality, he experiences just the reverse of ignorance is bliss. It then moves from wisdom to laughter and to hedonism and to wine. He then turns to works and women and wealth. But all these things lead to emptiness. He realizes that wisdom is far greater than foolishness, but both seem to lead to futility in view of the brevity of life and the universality of death. He concludes by acknowledging that contentment and joy are found only in God. So it's an intriguing material in that chapter, because when we consider, as we look at, going back to Ecclesiastes for just a moment, looking at chapter 2 in particular, you see then he said, let's test it. Let me try everything. So let me try pleasure. So he tried pleasure and wine and wit and women and wealth and works, a lot of W's. So he tried to stimulate his mind in this way in varying ways. And his works, he built many things: houses, vineyards, gardens, parks, fruit trees, ponds, massive things. He had massive quantities in his possessions, but no one else had anything like it. And then the multiplication of silver and gold, the treasure of kings and provinces. And so all of these things, and I became great. But then he says, my wisdom stood by, but all my eyes desired it and refused. And his heart was pleased because of his labor. Then I considered my activities. But then he said, and the labor which I exerted, what was all that about? Behold, all was vanity, was emptiness, striving after wind. There was no profit under the sun. So there's this pathos, a pathetic kind of motif that goes on here as we explore what does he mean then as he looks at these themes. And at this point then, he turns from his situation in life to more of a philosophical quest, beginning in chapter 3. But the conclusion still seems to remain the same, that the preacher considers the unchanging order of events, as well as the fixed laws of God. Time is short, as he knows. There's no eternity on earth. In fact, in chapter 3, he emphasizes this profound truth when he tells us in chapter 3, and this is that famous part here, time for everything to begin and so forth. Everything has its time and its season. And the song by the Byrds popularized this, and turn and so forth. But here's the verse I want you to note, where he says, he has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart. Yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Now that's a profoundly important truth. So you and I are God-haunted. We are haunted with time and eternity because he's placed eternity in your heart, but not such a way that you can comprehend the vastness of that in which you are encompassed. It's beyond your grasp, your ken. Yet you still have a sense of more, that you've got this capacity as one who is a bearer of the Imago Dei, one who's created in his image. You have this capacity because you're a spiritual being, and you can then understand that there are certain themes that others will not grasp. And so in that nature then, you have eternity. You have a longing for more. And it's very much along the lines of the wonderful Augustinian statement at the end of his first paragraph in his Confessions. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. And so he recognizes that only a transtemporal and transfinite entity, being, person, could ever really encompass and bear the weight of human aspirations, because we were meant to know God. Nothing less will do. And therefore, any other good on which we hope and put our felicity as our source of joy. If it's not the Creator himself, it will be, in fact, an idol, and that idol is for destruction. So when I think about that joy and futility and the whole concept of what that looks like, and I think about these P's that I so often give people, because they are each one's idols. They are maybe not physical idols, some, but essentially they may not be articles that we've graven images, but nevertheless they are idols, and the heart is an idol factory. So you see these 7 things, and people will give their soul, it seems, to get this, because they suppose if I only had this, or some combination thereof, then I would be happy. Then I would be content. Then my longings would be fulfilled. Because we always put off to the future our lack of contentment in the present. And so we suppose somehow the future will make up for it. And so we live in this fool's paradise, because none of these things will add up to anything. And at the end, if this is what we lived for, it'll be ashes in our mouth. Instead, we want more than these things, but these things won't lead to what we want. This is what we want. And we want that, but we'll not find them as the product of pursuing any of these others. Indeed, they are instead the byproduct of the pursuit of God above the others. And so that if you aim for God first and put him first and foremost, then the secondary things, such that that will be best for us, will be granted. But to pursue these secondary things above the first, you miss out on everything. And that's the terrible tragedy and the irony of that kind of a life. And so we're looking then at certain themes. Time is short, no eternity on earth at all. The futility of death seems to cancel the difference between righteousness and wickedness, because they both seem to go to the same place. And then chapters 4 to 5 explore the futility in social relationships. There are so many components of oppression and rivalry and covetousness and power. You have personal evil, and you have social evil, and you have structural evil. And in religious relationships, that of formalism or empty prayers and foolish vows. And then the world's offerings only seem to produce disappointment, not satisfaction. And so it intimates again that only ultimate meaning can only be found in the living God, which brings us then to this third section, beginning in chapter 7, a series of lessons on practical wisdom. And they portray levity and pleasure. And the quest for those things is superficial and foolish, and indeed says that it's better to have sober depth of thought, that wisdom and self-centered control provide perspective and strength in coping with life. Not self-centered control, but wisdom and self-control, rather, as I see it. That will carry us through, give us perspective, give us strength, and will help us cope with the difficulties. Indeed, one should enjoy the graces and gifts of God and receive them as such, and consider in adversity that God made both. So you want to avoid the twin extremes of self-righteousness and the other extreme of immorality, because sin invades all men, as he writes, and wisdom is cut short by evil and death. So he argues that the human mind cannot grasp ultimate meaning. Submission to authority helps one avoid unnecessary hardship, but real justice is often lacking on earth. He also argues in these chapters the uncertainties of life and the certainty of the grave show that God's purposes and ways often cannot be grasped in this life. So he goes on to say that one should therefore magnify opportunities while they last, because fortune can change suddenly. And so it seems to be almost kind of a stoic resignation that it would seem to intimate. But really, apart from something above the sun, apart from divine revelation, we have no materials to answer the fundamental questions of life, as I often say. When you're limited to revelation that's below the sun in this world, all you've got essentially to guide you is going to be a reason and evidentialism and evidence. So empiricism and rationalism. And these are two powerful ways of knowing things, but those ways are limited. and do not provide the Archimedean reference point that has to be away from the earth to provide the ability to see above, the wisdom from above. And so without those perspectives, then it's not enough to answer the fundamental questions of life. And you know what they are. Although it's astonishing to me that so many people can go, indeed, sometimes decades without asking these basic questions and wrestling with them. The question of, who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? Where am I going? So basic, so simple, but people will do almost anything to avoid and avert them because they don't want to be haunted by that kind of quest. They want to be haunted by the folly of this illusory world. So when things go wrong, often, for example, funerals may be windows of vulnerability that force us to reckon with what's been there all along and we refuse to see it, namely the brevity of this earthbound sojourn and the question of what's it all about? What's the purpose? What's the meaning of it? And most people just seem to have little appetite for that. They don't want to think about these big questions because in their heart of hearts, they know they don't have answers. And so we become wise then when we wrestle with them and realize, though, that apart from God's revelation, special revelation from above the sun, we'd have no hope and power and capacity to do so. So the essential movement then is that the good life is only attained really by revering God. And those who fail to take God and his will seriously into account, they're going to be doomed then to live lives of foolishness and futility. That life will not wait upon the solution of all its problems. Nevertheless, there can be some real meaning that can be found not by looking under the sun, but beyond the sun to what he calls the one shepherd. And so we have topics that range through a declaration and a demonstration of vanity and deliverance from vanity. Or another way of looking at it, from the subject to sermons, and then to a summary. All these things are just ways of just providing a little bit of a map, but there's so many components that it's so hard to simplify in that manner. But the whole universe under the sun in the time, not Tim, is about 935 BC. So it just gives us that theme. So I'm going to bring us up. That brings us up to the theme and purpose of this book. And I think that would be a good enough place for us to stop the study and then open it up for some interactions. So about what is the theme and the purpose of this book? What does that look like? So I'm going to now open it up to your thoughts and questions in the remaining 15 minutes we've got.
Ken, I'll take this opportunity to thank you for that.
Oh,
I take notes very, very quickly.
Oh, good.
Thank you so very much.
Oh, good. I'm glad you take notes quickly. That's you. That serves you well, I bet, in your life. That can be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Karen, Sally.
Hey, Sally.
Seinfeld did a great job dealing with the absurdities of life.
Many
That
times,
show.
yes. The whole show is a show about nothing, as you know. It's the whole point. How can you have a show about nothing? And yet, it's intriguing. It was a brilliant thing that just captured people, just like the soup Nazi or any number of crazy little themes that surface over meaningless, dopey things. It's amazing that they pulled this off, but it became so profoundly successful. What's interesting about Seinfeld, as you know, is that he decided to pull it before they began to decline. So at the very peak, after 9 seasons, he didn't bring it out to 10. 9 seasons, he said, that's it. But it was an ingenious show and just had this incredible chemistry, as you know, with the cast of the key 4 characters, and then all the ringing of the changes on these things. It's a show about nothing, though.
Yeah, Larry David also, as I told you,
Yes, yeah.
Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Oh,
Well,
of
that's
course,
a
yeah.
little.
Yeah, Curb Your Enthusiasm. Yeah, that's the amazing thing about Larry David and Curb Your Enthusiasm is that he's the butt of his own jokes. I mean, it's constantly he's the one. Everything falls apart. He's got all his plans, and then it's almost you're embarrassed for him almost in every season. And that's a strange kind of a form of comedy that's like a Schadenfreude, a pleasure at another's misfortune. There are some comics who do that very well. there's whole stories. Dame Edna Everage is another example of that. So what other thoughts do you have on this book? Was there anything specific that I brought up that needs to be clarified perhaps a little bit more in this book?
Ken,
Yes.
this is Bunky.
Hey, Bunky. Yeah.
Would you talk just a bit about God gives many fine things in life
Mm-hmm.
that we enjoy, be it experiences, families, wives, even possessions.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about the balance between how to enjoy those things without idolizing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a wise question because you don't want to take one extreme or the other, and total asceticism and the rigors that produces, it becomes a kind of a self-deprecating diminishment because we are embodied beings. And if anything, the biblical perspective, the whole biblical theism provides the most robust basis for an incarnational theology that treasures the actual daily experiences of life and the pleasures and the things that we have. Even though we know that they're short-lived, it invites us to treasure those to some degree. And as you well know, as the scriptural revelation and progressively increases, we begin to see more and more how to do that and why that becomes powerful until we can begin to learn the mystery of practicing his presence and the splendor of the ordinary, and that everything matters. So this enriches our lives. But this whole idea of the wise approach to enjoy it and thank God for it, be grateful, have gratitude and contentment, for this is your lot. At the same time, not to make it defining and making your joy dependent upon it. Or on the other case, when a person does not have these things and they're bereft of that, for them not to make their life one of a victim narrative that they if they only had this, if only, because that's also a fool's narrative. So it explores both sides, the pains and the pleasures, the injustices. All of these are very clear in this text, and it helps us then to have this attitude. It seems to me, if you do have a good, if there's something that's you're enjoying, hold it with a loose grip and know it's all that you are and have is gift and grace. And knowing that, then, enjoy it, thank God in it, and seek, especially as followers of Jesus now, because this goes beyond the wisdom of this book, because the wisdom of Christ, the Logos, who became for us wisdom and knowledge and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, he is the ultimate wisdom that we now have indwelling us. So that amplifies this. But even there, in both instances, we are wise to be grateful and to live in this now and to treasure and the precious present, because there's advice in this book that tells us to do it. But at the same time, to not base our identity upon the possessions or the attainment of certain ends of our own aspirations. I find that this is a constant theme in my own life. It's so easy to make my joy dependent upon a series of events that I myself have construed but cannot control. And then to do that, and you can't control them, and it won't end up the way you thought. And then to recalibrate my life so that to bring it back into alignment with the one who calls me to walk with him. And so enjoy it, hold it with a loose grip. Don't let it define you, because a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions, but rather we are called by our Lord Jesus to be rich toward God and to have a heavenly portfolio that will not be stolen or tarnished or diminished. So all these themes in my mind tell us that the optimal good, how do we define the optimal good? What's the summum bonum? What's the supreme good? Yeah. So these are timeless questions that we need to raise, that are indeed raised with eloquence in this book, wonderfully well. Yeah.
Ken, this is Emerson Hartzler in the Kansas City area. There's something that just came to my mind that might relate well to this in terms of the wisdom of possessions. There's a gentleman who's now passed, but called Henry Block, and Henry was one of the founding brothers of H&R Block.
Oh, H&R Block, yeah. Uh-huh.
And so he ended up with about 40 some impressionist paintings, originals, in his home, which were extremely valuable. And but he was starting to worry about people breaking in and stealing, and I guess the insurance costs were running pretty high. And so he called up the Nelson Art Gallery, which is our city art gallery here, and gave a proposition to them and said, "How would you like to have 42
Oh my word!
impressionist painting?" But these are marvelous. And so, make a long story short, he gave those to the art gallery. The art gallery then called it a photographer, professional photographer, and printed them on special paper, framed them in their original frames, and gave them back to him. So now he has prints
I see.
of original art in his home, in the same places, the same frames, everything.
Yeah.
Unless you're an art expert, you would never know they weren't the originals because they're so well done.
Oh, yeah.
But then the art gallery, and so I've been there a number of times, and it's a wonderful block art gallery section of Nelson that has all these paintings and others that they just consolidate all their impressionist paintings in one.
Oh my word! That's in Kansas. You say that's in Kansas City?
That's in Kansas City, and so it's.
What's the name of the art gallery? What's it called? I'm just curious.
The Nelson Atkins Art.
I'll tell you that they put that thing on the map. That one gift alone puts.
Yeah. So if you're ever in Kansas City, it's
absolutely. I intend to do that now. Next time I'm there, I've been there before, and no one told me about that gallery. I would have wanted to see it.
It's a block gallery within
Wow.
Nelson, and it's all of his and other. They just consolidated their total collection of impressionist paintings.
And
So
what a wonderful thing for him to do as well, because the realization here, I'm trying to hold on and hoard. And that's another thing that I think is a wisdom thing. It's instead of hoarding, he is now, in fact, inviting others to share in that goodness and that beauty. And yet he still has it in his house, and only he knows it's not the same. But, it's the realization every time he realizes that others are now able to see what they would never have seen if it was limited to my living room. So there's a wisdom. Isn't that a nice thought too? He's leveraging that beauty and still enjoying it in his home, but now it's been magnified. Who knows how many thousands of people have seen those paintings? Wonderful.
And his insurance costs are lower.
It's what now? It's
And
what?
his insurance costs are lower.
Yeah, that's true. His fears are a great deal lower. The worst thing that happens, he loses the frames. That's a good story. Has that been written up somewhere?
Yeah, there's been some videos made and publicized, not greatly.
Yeah.
But,
If you wouldn't mind sending me if there's a little article that summarizes what you just told me. I think it's a grand story. Just send it to me. Yeah, that'd be great. If the website has a contact, but that'd be lovely, because isn't that a grand story about taking what you've been given, and then it's what you give away that really is yours in the end. You see, so that's wisdom to me. Not only the relief from the burden of those things that would hold you down and tether you, so he won't enjoy them because he's always afraid. It's a great story. I like that. It's a wise response, and I like it very much.
Ken,
Yes.
was part of Solomon's problem the same thing that kind of happened when the Israelites wanted to kind of take on what the surrounding tribes would do during the time of Saul? Like, oh, we don't want to be an example for the pagan tribes around us.
Yeah.
We're going to copy what they're doing.
Yeah.
And then he kind of intermarried, because when you intermarry with the different tribes, it was a way to try to make peace between them.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. So this is a way of actually forming alliances effectively through or through intermarriage. But the problem there is that then he's being seduced away from the one true God who manifested himself and who revealed himself to Solomon. You don't forget, this is the guy who was given the opportunity in a vision to actually, what would you want? I'll give you anything you want. And what did he choose? He chose to wanted to have humility, to lead Israel and to lead them with humility and with wisdom. And so he started so well. So he got it. He got the idea of the majesty of the living God, and he wanted to honor the name of God by the exquisite beauty that the temple would represent, and all of those other motifs are there. And yet somehow, because of these alliances that are visible and tangible, because you don't have any image of Yahweh, there's no physical statue. And people lust for and crave the temporal, the manageable, something I can physically touch and hold and count and control and compare and compete and quantify. And when they do that, it seduces them away from the one who is in fact invisible and who is omnipresent. And so we want to contextualize and bring them down to our level in space and time. And that's the idolatry of the heart that would always wish to do that. And so the book, again, points to that kind of folly that we all can have in a much lesser degree, perhaps in terms of the scale or scope, but it's the principle still remains the same, doesn't it? It's a downward pull of seduction. And as we well know, and we've heard it again and again, how many people have said that the more you have, the more you want? And it seems that if a person were told, suppose a man is, let's say, 20 years old, how much would it take for you to be content? How much would be enough? And suppose they then said, oh, and then let's be modest, and let's say 5 million they suppose they should have. Of course, when they got 5 million, they ask the same question, it's been doubled. They ask the same question, it's another double. It keeps going up logarithmically because it's never enough. And that combined with the fact of a diminished good, as the whole psychology of addiction shows us, that you have to pay more and more to get less and less. And that the diminishments, because we were not meant for idols, for things that are imitators, to set our hearts on things beneath the dignity to which we've been called to aspire. So it's a natural thing. So there's a self-corrupting, a corroding, and then a cynicism driving ethos that can lead a person to despair and cynicism, or any number of things. In the end, a sense of futility and meaninglessness. And there's no question that life is full of injustices and absurdities and follies. It doesn't make any sense from a human point of view. But only the living God who made all things and who is bringing it to a telos. There is an end, there is a purpose. It's not just one thing after another, but it is heading somewhere. And the consummation of history is the fourth act. After creation and fall and redemption, there is the consummation of all things. So that's where history is heading. With that mindset, then, I wouldn't be in despair, and I realize that we are not just going in circles, but we're heading somewhere. And for the pilgrim on this world, the follower of Christ, he knows who he is or she is, that they are aliens and sojourners and wayfarers and strangers and exiles and wanderers in this world. So they recognize that. And that's the wisdom, to sum it all up, the wisdom of realizing that this world is not home. It's preparation for home. And so what we call death is really a birth to the true world for which we've been made. So that was, yes,
This is Janice. It seems like I was just thinking about this, as wise as Solomon was, and it's, we all want to live wisely.
Sure.
But it seems like I was thinking that is not enough for a deep, loving, intimate relationship with God.
Yes. In fact, I made this decision. It's an interesting one. I think I only alluded to it, but I'm going to show you what I mean, and this was where we'll close tonight. But I made this decision when I was thinking about this conference at the Cove, and the last session would be this. And I haven't taught that session. Michael Stewart's going to be doing session 6 here, and we're taking each of these mini-series and turning them into one single teaching. But to synthesize it, there's a powerful thing in synthesizing it. Well, what's the content of living a life of truth, goodness, and beauty? When it says we've been created and redeemed to glorify God as living incarnations of his wisdom, what would that look like? And I got to thinking about that, and yesterday it dawned on me that I think the way for me to approach that is these 10 marks of a disciple that, and I'm going to make a handout that'll have all 10 of them. Not claiming I'm going to go through them all, but I'll just say a few key words about each one, and then allude to where I'm doing. I've taught these, and each one on their own. But I think, yeah, if I wanted to look at what's a life look like, you'd be a person who has, because we've been talking about in a eternal perspective. You'd have a growing grasp of your true identity, of who you really are and whose you are. You'd have a growing apprehension of practicing His presence and turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Splendor in the ordinary. You would have a desire to pursue Him above all other earthbound goods, knowing that none of them are even can compare. You'd have a desire to train in the disciplines, not so much to as ends in themselves, but as means to the ends of intimacy. You would become also increasingly conscious of and dependent on the guidance and power of the Spirit of God. You'd grow both in the love and fear of the Lord, and the fear of God has been greatly downplayed in our time, and that's to our peril. And then this newest one I added, this it used to be 9, this perception of delighting in nature. And I say both doxologically for the glory of God, but also I coined this term phabologically, which just means it means fear, the phobos. But it's using nature to amplify the fear of God, because you're beginning to say, what am I beholding? And it becomes sometimes moments of ineffable astonishment. And then purpose. What is my purpose? And we all have this purpose in this life for which we're called, a universal and unique purpose. And then finally, longing in anticipation for His coming. So if I were to summarize that to me wouldn't be a bad way, seems to me now, of, at least that's what I'm going to try out on next Sunday, what I mean by that.